Welcome back. In earlier video, you got introduced to what is Spring and why Spring, and you have converted a non-Spring application to a Spring application. You have compared the advantages of using Spring. We understood that application context is a subtype of Bean Factory, and you also have understood about how to use class path XML application context if your XML is in class path, and if your XML is in some file system like C drive or D drive or any other folder, then you also understood that you can use file system XML application context. Now let us start from the same point. We'll discuss some more features of dependency injection. So in this video you are going to understand about three topics. First one, how to split your configuration into multiple files and why to do it. Then we'll see and understand about what are C namespaces and P namespace. And also I'll talk about an interesting thing, how to externalize your configurations to a .properties file. That will be the agenda for this video. So let us see. If you see the previous XML file, this is one XML file, application config I have used right now. Here I am configuring data source, all the repositories, email service, and bank service. We have injected data source using constructor injection, and we have injected all these dependencies using setter injection. The first thing in your mind may be when to use constructor injection and when to use setter injection. Let me ask you. Tell me, for JDBC account repository, is data source a mandatory dependency? Mandatory dependency means if I don't inject data source into JDBC account repository, will any of the method work? No, because in all of the methods we are using data source.get connection. If I don't initialize data source, I would get a null pointer exception. So data source is a mandatory dependency. Okay. Then let me ask you one more thing. If you see bank service IMPL, it is having 4 dependencies, and let's talk about email service. If you see, wherever I am using email service, I am checking. If email service is not null, then only I am calling a method. Even if you see the credit method, here also I am sending an email only if email service is not null. So my methods in bank service will work even though email service is not injected. I can say that email service is an optional dependency, right? So one best practice is, if you have some mandatory dependencies and if you want to force the user to inject those dependencies, better use a constructor injection. That means, let's say I'm giving a constructor for bank service IMPL. I'll just go to source, generate constructor using fields. I have right now created only one constructor which is taking 3 arguments. There are no other constructors. Is there any way that I can create an object of bank service IMPL without passing any one of this? No, right? So if an object of this class has to be created, you have to pass all the 3. So there is no way of escaping without passing any dependency. So better if you have some mandatory dependencies, do the injection of those mandatory dependencies via constructor, and optional dependencies, it's up to you. You can use either constructor injection or setter injection. Hope you got a clear idea on what to use now. Okay, so let us go to the next thing. If you see my configuration file, all the beans are in single XML file. That's okay. Now my application is very small. I have only some 5-6 beans. What if the application is very big and if you have to configure all your beans into a single XML file, it will be difficult to manage the XML file. So it's always a good idea to split your application into modules and have a separate file for each module. Now Let us split one configuration file into two. Let me do it. So I'm working on this XMLDI multiple configuration start. The classes are same as the one in the previous application which you have worked on. Now I'm going to create a new XML file. I will say the XML file name as infrastructure-config.xml and I'll say finish. So it's added. So what I feel is all the infrastructure related beans like data source, etc., if they can be separated out, it's a good idea. So now I'll take this data source bean and then copy paste it here. So now I have data source bean in a separate XML. Now I have two XMLs. Now your question may be, how can I create an application context by using two XMLs? It's so simple. Let me open the test case which I used earlier. Whenever I'm creating application context, I can say comma, you can give comma separated files. I'll write infrastructure-config.xml. Okay, now this application context will load both the XML files and it will inject the dependencies. And one more thing I would like to tell you, here in this application config I am using a ref is equals to data source, but in this file is there any data source bean? No. So the data source bean is in other file. You can always refer to a bean in other file as well, because if you see how application context is getting created, we are passing two comma separated files. What this application context will do is, first it will load all the bean definitions in all XML files, then only it will start creating objects. Before application context starts creating objects, it will load all the bean definition files. So whether all the beans are in one XML or in multiple XMLs, it is one and the same. Only for our modularity, only for our maintenance, we split our configuration into multiple files. So you can refer to a bean which is defined in one file inside another file as well. Okay, hope you clearly understood about it. Now one more question which you might have in your mind is, what if I have this infrastructure-config.xml in my C drive? Let me just show you. In my C drive, let's say I will paste it. I have infrastructure-config.xml in my C drive. So how to create application context now? One file is in class path and one file is in C drive. Assume that this file is not there in SRC main resources. So how? For one file you have to use class path XML application context, and for another file you have to use file system XML application context. No need. What you can do is, here whenever you are telling the second file name, you can use file : C drive /. That's it. It will load the configuration file from the file system. So you can use a combination of some files in class path and some combination of files can be in file system. You can just use the prefix file : that's all. This will tell the application context to look in the file system. Okay, so hope that is clear. Now let me run the same test case. I have both the files in class path only as of now. Let me run whether it will pass a file. Oh, now what is it saying? There is no such method bank service impl.init. Why? Because in bank service IML, just now I created a constructor which is taking 3 arguments. There is no default constructor. So, but in my XML I have configured to call default constructor. That's a problem. Now what I'll do is I'll just comment this out, and then there's a default constructor. Now it should work. Yep, worked, and the test case succeeded. So now you understood how to use multiple configuration files. Okay, so let me just go through it. Whenever you are getting a bean from the context, you can say context.getBean and pass the ID. The return type of this getBean method is object, so you have to typecast. But there is one more getBean method which is using generics. The second argument you have to pass the class type. You need not typecast. So you are saying get a bean with ID and of type bank service.class. Or the third way is you don't need to pass even the ID. You can just say context.getBean bank service.class. Now the application context will check, is there any bean of type bank service? If yes, it will give you. It will be okay as long as there is no conflict. What if there are two beans of same type bank service? Then this getBean method is going to throw an exception. So you can use a third syntax only when you are sure that there is only one bean of same type, right? Okay, so you also understood about how to configure multiple configuration files, right? Another advantage of multiple configuration files is I could maintain one infrastructure file for testing and one for production. So what I'll do is in SRC test resources, I'll create one more infrastructure file. Let's say I'll create a new test-infrastructure-config.xml, and what I can do is I can configure the data source pointing to a test database. Here I can change the database name, something like SpringDB test. So I'm having two XML files for infrastructure, one for production and one for testing. So what I can do is whenever I'm creating an application context in test environment, I will use test-infrastructure-config.xml along with application config, and whenever I'm using a production environment, I will use prod-infrastructure-config. But in both the environments, am I not sharing the application config.xml? Yes, that is the benefit of splitting your configuration into multiple files. You can reuse some XMLs. Hope it is clear. Then next, whenever you are having multiple XML files, you can import one XML file into another XML file by using import tag. So let me just show you. If you feel that application config is a main one, what I can do, I can write an import and give resources equals to class path. If you are having your XML in class path, you can use class path : whatever file name, infrastructure-config.xml. Okay. Now whenever you are creating application context, what you can do? Do you need to give separated files? No. So you have only one main XML file, application config.xml, which is already importing infrastructure config. So whenever you are having multiple files, you can also write import tags like this to import the XML files. If you don't use class path prefix, here if I'm not using class path prefix, then this infrastructure config.xml should be in a relative directory to the current file, that is application-config.xml, right? So it's up to you whether you use prefix or not. If you want to specify the path starting from class path, you can use class path : If the file infrastructure config-xml is in the same folder as application config.xml, then you don't need to give prefix. Okay. So what you can do is you can just open the lab documentation file for this topic and you can work on it. Please pause the video and complete the lab exercise. Welcome back. Now let us try to understand various scopes. What are different scopes? So let me just use the same example which I used. I have two XML files. I'll give comma separated. Infrastructure dash config.xml. Okay. Now let's say I will say context.getBean twice. Assume that I have two variables of type bank service. This is bank service 1 and bank service 2. I am saying context.getBean bank service twice. How many objects of bank service will be created? Can you guess? Let me tell you. Let me ask a simple question. Analyze it. I told you already, when this line is executed, all the bean definitions configured in XML will be loaded and all bean objects are created. Whenever we say context.getBean, it is not creating a new object, it is just giving the reference of this bean. So if you call context.getBean twice also, you will be getting same reference, right? So by default, application context will create only one object per bean definition. That means application context will treat all the bean definitions as singletons. But sometimes you may want a different object whenever you say context.getBean. So what you can do is you can specify scope is equals to prototype. So that means object of this bean will not be created during startup. It will be created only on requirement, only when required. So if you say scope is equals to prototype, whenever context.getBean is called, it will create a new object. By default, the scope is singleton. That's why only one object will be created during startup. If scope is equals to prototype, tell me, is this bean created during startup? Yes or no? Just think logically. I will say yes. Why? Because tell me, is this bank service singleton? If I don't specify scope, the default scope is singleton. So that means whenever I am creating application context, it will try to create bank service IMPL. But bank service IMPL is dependent on account repository, which is a prototype. So as account repository is required for bank service, application context will create one object and initialize it. But then now you may ask, hey, what is the difference between scope is equals to prototype and singleton now? The difference is, suppose if you are injecting, let's assume, if you are injecting say account repository into another bean like this, assume in this case, just I'm showing you in this case, if you are injecting account repository into this bean also, now tell me, how many objects of JDBC account repository IMPL will be created? Here one object and here one object, two objects. But if it was singleton, only one reference of account repository will be injected to all the beans. So that is the difference between scope is equals to prototype and singleton. Hope it is very clear for you. Okay, now let me remove this. Just like scope is equals to prototype and singleton, you have two more scopes, request and session. These scopes are specific to web environment as the name says request. If you want one object per request, then you can specify scope is equals to request, or if you want one object per session, you can specify scope is equals to session, right? So these are scopes. That's fine until then. Now let us see new topic, C namespace and P namespace. Let me show you through code. I have a separate project here. If you see, I have two XML files. One is application-config and one is test infrastructure config. In these two XML files, I am injecting constructor. I am doing constructor injection by using constructor tag. I am doing setter injection by using property tag. But I feel that the XML is becoming very verbose because for every dependency I have to write one line. So there is a shortcut. What you can do is, see what all namespaces are used. There are different namespaces. So if you want to add one more namespace, what you can do, you can go to namespaces, select C namespace, right, and also select P namespace. Then come back to source and see. Did you see names XMLNS:C and XMLNS:P? Yes. That means we have imported C namespace and P namespace. Okay. There are other namespaces as well in this file. Actually, if I go to namespace, I can deselect the ones which I don't want. I don't want context. I don't want JDBC. I don't want JEE. I'll come back. Are they removed? Yes. So what is the default namespace? The default namespace is pointing to the one ending with beans, and the corresponding schema is XSD. Okay. For this C namespace and P namespace, do you see any XSD here? No. Right? So remember, for C namespace and P namespace, there is no schema. Okay. Now what I'll do is, whenever I want to do constructor injection, instead of writing constructor arg tag, I will use C : control space data source dash ref. I will use data source dash ref because I want to refer to another bean. Now I will remove constructor arg. So using C namespace, you can do constructor injection like this, right? Whenever you press control space, if you are using Spring Toolsuite, you will get the help. And whenever I press C namespace, control space, see, I got data source dash ref and data source, right? When to use dash ref, when to use data without ref. If you want to refer to another bean, you have to use property name, constructor argument name, dash ref. If it is a simple value type like string, int, etc., you can use without dash ref. So since in this case data source is another bin I want to refer to it, I used dash ref. Similarly, I will replace everything with C namespace and D name and all. And whenever I want to do setter injection, don't use property tag. I will use instead of using property tag, I will use P namespace, P : control space account repository dash ref account repository. Okay. P : email service dash ref P : transaction repository dash ref reward repository dash ref. See, the XML became less verbose right now by using P namespace and C namespace. That's how you can use. C namespace and P namespace for constructor injection as well as setter injection. Now, is there any difference in performance? Let me see how to actually create an application context and use. Is there any difference? Let us see. If you see how I'm creating application context, it's the same way. I'm passing comma separated XML file names and I'll run it. Let us see whether the test case will pass or not. Yep, same output. So performance wise, there is no difference between using C namespace, P namespace, or constructor or tag and property tag. It's only to simplify the XML configurations. Hope it is clear how to use C namespace and P namespace. Now, what you can do is you can open the lab documentation for this corresponding thing and you can work on it. So the lab documentation which you have to work on is this one, fourth one, C-P namespaces. Go ahead and do it. In my next video, I'm going to show you about how to externalize the configuration to a .properties file. See you in next video.